Hi, this is Ed from the Tattoo Codes, and in our last video, we created unique IDs for our to-do list items by creating a count variable outside the scope of our other functions. Then, whenever we click on Add To Do, it calls the createToDo function, which increments this counter variable. We then use the value of the counter variable at that moment in time to create our unique ID and pass that ID to our to-do list items and then onto our onComplete and onDelete functions. So we have our onDelete function set up. Let's work on the onComplete function. So first, let me clean up my code. Okay, so when we click on the complete button, we want to show the user that this to-do is finished. And as such, we should make it so that it's not visible to the user anymore once they complete it. And just remember, so the HTML content for each to-do list item is based on a variable that we have called content, which is an li element at the moment. So let's look at the entire code of our application. To do this quickly, I'm just going to click on this button to open our application in a new tab. Let me add at least 2 to-dos to this application. Then I'm going to click on F12 to open up the developer tools. And let's inspect the element. We can see that each to-do list HTML code is wrapped in li elements. What we could do is, we could change this entire code to a paragraph element that just reads to-do completed. And to do this, we use the element property called innerHTML. So this is just another element property that we can alter our HTML markup. It's similar to the insert adjacent HTML function that we used before, but this time it will replace the entire HTML instead of just adding new content to it. So I'm just going to show you an example REPL application that I have to demonstrate the innerHTML property. We have an index.html file that has 3 buttons: change to header, change to paragraph, change to link. Each of these buttons calls a different JavaScript function. I'll show you in a minute. We also have a div with the ID, the div, and within it, a span element with the words starting HTML. So let's look at the script.js file. We have a variable div, which is pointing to the div element with ID, the div. We then have 3 variables: the header content, which is referring to an h1 element, paragraph content, which is referring to a paragraph element, and link content, which refers to an a element. We then have 3 separate functions. I'll click on each button and explain what's happening. So if we load the application, we can see that the div says starting HTML. If I click on the change to header button, this will call the innerHTML property on that div element, and it's going to set it to whatever the header content is, which is our h1 element. If we click on the change to paragraph button, it's going to call the innerHTML property as well on the div element, but now we're going to be setting the paragraph content to it. And finally, if we click on the change to link button, what that will do is it's going to call the innerHTML property on the div element, but this time set it to the link content. So we can see the innerHTML, it will always replace whatever the current HTML content is on that element. So back to our code. Let's look at our onComplete function. This is where most of our changes will occur. And I have a quick quiz for you. I want you to create a paragraph element and set it to a variable. The string within the paragraph element can say whatever you want. Then, find the to-do list element with the ID passed into this function, and then set the innerHTML to the new paragraph element you just create. Pause the video quickly and just give it a try, and I'll show you how I do it. Okay, so first let's create the variable called, I'm going to call it completed content. And then I'm going to set this to a paragraph element. So open angular brackets, p close angular brackets to do completed, open angular brackets / p close angular brackets. Next, we have to get the HTML element of the to-do list we just clicked on. And what we do is we use the document dot get element by ID, open parentheses, and we pass the ID that gets passed into the complete functions, close parentheses. We then set this to-do list to a new HTML with dot innerHTML equals to completed content. So let's reload the REPL application to test it out. So I'm going to click on add to do. I'm going to click on complete on any of the to-dos, and you can see immediately the content gets replaced with the paragraph that we just made. But if we stay on the screen now, we'll notice that the message doesn't go away, and that's not what we want. It'll be great if after a short amount of time this message just deletes itself or removes itself. We've already got the delete function that we can use, and we can pass the ID to that delete function. But what about some sort of time delay? There is a method that we can use for that, and it's called setTimeout. So what is setTimeout? So this is an inbuilt method that we can call within our JavaScript file. We just need to call it directly within our file, and it does take at least 2 or more parameters. In our code, we'll be focusing on passing 3 parameters. So the first parameter that we're going to be passing is a reference to the function that we want to call, and it's very important that I emphasize the word reference, which I'll explain later. So for me, I want to pass in a reference to the onDelete function to this setTimeout. Secondly, we want to pass in an amount of time that we want the setTimeout method to wait before it calls the onDelete function. Note that you have to pass in milliseconds, and 1000 milliseconds is 1 second. The third and fourth parameter that you can pass in, and it does depend on your function, is the parameter that you want. So in my case, it's going to be the ID that I get. So let's look at another REPL example I've got for you. We have a function here called setTimeout, which is immediately called in our JavaScript file. It's going to accept 3 parameters. This change to length function and a reference to it. 3000 as in 3000 milliseconds or 3 seconds. And then a string that just says link to a parent's help site. Let's modify the change to link function quickly so that it accepts a parameter. I'm just going to call it message, and we're just going to go console.log message to console log out. Now, when we reload the REPL application, we wait for 3 seconds, and immediately we see that the content changes into a link, which is based on the change to link function that we called earlier. And we can see in the console log that the string appears as well. Just going back to the first parameter, again, we are passing a reference to the function change to link. You may think, why can't I just put change to link function here with the parameter? Let's give it a quick try now. So I'm going to add the parentheses, and then I'm going to pass in a string as an argument to this function. And when I rerun the REPL application, you will see that the HTML content changes immediately. The reason is, once you insert those parentheses in, JavaScript sees this as a function and immediately calls it. So that setTimeout method just does not cause any delay in the calling of this function, which is why we make sure that we pass a reference to this function, change to link instead. So back to our code. Within the onComplete function again, we're going to be incorporating our setTimeout method. We're going to pass in 3 parameters here. So the first will be a reference to our onDelete function. So onDelete. And then we're going to put in a time for the second parameter. So I'm just going to say 3000. And then we're going to pass in the ID because I want my onDelete function to know that this is the ID to delete. Now let's reload the REPL application. we're going to create a couple of to-dos, and I'm going to click complete on one of them, and after 3 seconds we'll see that the to-do gets removed. Perfect. So as a final quick quiz, remember the counter variable that we looked at in the last video. Create another global variable and set this to 3000 milliseconds. You can name this variable anything you like. Then I want you to update the setTimeout code that we just wrote now with this global variable instead of the 3000 milliseconds. So give it a quick try now. Okay, so I would just create a new variable. I'm just going to call it delete time and then set it to 3000. Then I go back to my setTimeout function and replace the 3000 milliseconds with this variable delete time. Let me reload the application, add a to-do, then click on the complete button, and shortly after we will see that it gets deleted. Fantastic. So both our complete and delete buttons are working. The only problem we have is that if we enter in the to-do, so I'm just going to put one in quickly, make time to code when the kids are at school. And if I reload the Replit application, we lose our to-dos. So in our next video, we're going to be going through how to set up our application to save our to-dos so that we can retrieve them again at will. So I'll see you in the next video. Take care and all the best.